And what do you think is the best connector? What makes the difference in the connector? Is it too much kind of movement or
So for the connectors, obviously, when there is a release, it's good as long as it's cables. If you have a patch, it makes sense that it's quite well attached, with the assumption that the people will not sleep on it or will not scratch it away. And then when you look at smart textiles, so there are a lot of companies who offers special connectors for the smart textile, but one problem you have there is that connectors and being washable doesn't go that well together. So there are some certain solution, but then when you, for example, use a USB connector on a smart textile, it will be difficult to wash it many times. And from our perspective, one of the best connectors is still the snap button because it's so versatile.
Yeah.
Even on smart textile.
Yeah, sounds good. And then we talked about the impedance, we talked about the artifact. So the impedance is changing when you have a longer measurement. It's maybe changing after a few hours, it's maybe changing after 3 days. So it will affect the signal quality. And then you can also have movement artifacts. And if you measure the full, for example, ECG curve, you would see some changes there. So you can maybe tell us, how do you see the changes? How does it change the signal quality? And then also, if you just measure heart rate or heart rate variability, is there a chance that you can actually notice that now this signal is not good and the data is not correct?
So how it changed when you change the impedance over time? That was the question. So basically, when you have a low impedance and you have motion artifacts, the motion artifacts get less through than if the impedance is high. So when the impedance is high, you would notice every little motion. That you also see that very well when you take a polar belt and you haven't humidified it yet. So and then you jump around and then you would see like the signal which is affected quite strong. So but once you humidify it, you will realize, oh, the signal is actually quite good, even I'm jumping around like before. So you see that also with the electrodes. When the electrodes dry out, or for example, like detach a little bit from the skin, which also increases the impedance, then the signal quality will get worse, especially under active. If you are lying on the bed, then probably you will not notice much. But once there's activity, then the effect is quite strong.
Yeah, so you need the low impedance to get the noise level smaller. And is there, like, let's say that I would do heart rate variability measurements for 10 days and I only get the RR interval data. I don't have the full curve, so I cannot observe it.
That was the second question.
Yeah, can I anyway figure out that is my data good after, for example, the 5th day, 5 to 10 days? Maybe the first 5 days was good, but can I see from the HRV signal, can I analyze it in a way that I know if the data is good or not?
Yeah, so with the HRV of the HR data, you have the luxury in a way that you are just using the R peak. And the R peak is the strongest one. So sometimes the R peak can be so strong that it even goes through the noise. And with some algorithm or with some, even like the one from Cubius or so, you can actually detect it even you have not such a good signal. But then again, once you have a high impedance and suddenly you have electrostatic, the electrostatic will override the R peak. What is good on that, it's mostly electrostatic. You can have, on the one hand, filter it out, and on the other hand, you can control it by what you're wearing. So if you have, for example, a polyester, you probably have higher electrostatic. Or if people sweat less, then they also have high electrostatic. Because when you're a little bit wet on the skin, the electrostatic goes other ways and doesn't go through the electrode.
All right. So what would be the ideal clothing then if you want the optimal signal quality?
If you want an optimal signal, then no clothing would be the best.
Yes.
So when you do like sports studies or so, maybe it makes sense to not have a shirt. and just have the belt or just have the electrodes with the sensors. But then normally what we realize is if you take, for example, a spray, water spray, and you just spray a little bit around the electrodes and make it a little bit wet, and the whole electrostatic would go all the ways. And then it doesn't affect it. But all these things are not very practical when you have to measure 24/7. Like for the short term, it's an okay solution. Or for example, let's say somebody has electrodes on and are going now for the run, and then at the beginning of the run, the electrostatic is quite high from the shirt. So that would be an option that you just wetten it before. So you can instruct the research object to do that, the person. But ideally, it's like you just use good electrodes or you have the belt well prepared.
And is there a difference between synthetic materials and kind of natural materials on a shirt, for example?
Yeah, with polyester, the electrostatic is higher, but to be honest, in practice, we also found cotton quite high.
Okay, yeah.
So yeah, but I don't know the let's say the numbers behind it. It's just like our experience.
Yeah.
When we're
No,
testing.
I understand. And if I go a little bit back, so you said that if you are just analyzing the HRV or HR, you have the strong R peak and it's easier to detect even if it's not optimal. So basically, if you are measuring the ECG and you want to see ST depression or something like cardiac things, then it becomes much more critical if you want to see the other ones. Good. Yeah.
And only, sorry if I take this point. When you look at cardiologists, so they are like two groups. I mean, obviously, just metaphorically speaking, but one of them, they are big fans of the small patches because they get more data, since like the patches are for long-term wear. And even the data or the signal quality is not as good, but at least they get much more data. And other ones, they say like, no, I don't need more data, I need more accurate data. And then you are back on the classical Holter device where you have a higher amplitude because the electrodes have a bigger distance between. And then, especially the classical Holter device are especially good for these little waves, the P wave or the RST complex and so on. So because you see them better, you have kind of a higher resolution.
Yeah. And you said about the distance. I haven't actually thought about it. So sometimes you have it really far, like already in the side of the body and high. And then, for example, in heart rate belt, they are very close. So how does it actually affect like the distance between the electrodes that are being compared?
Yeah, so it depends also a little bit on the positioning. So let's say if somebody is obese and has a lot of fat, then even you have a higher distance, maybe the signal quality wouldn't be as good as somebody who is thin. But generally speaking, the higher the distance, the better the signal quality. And that's why sometimes you see patches which are quite far from each other, like at least the electrodes are quite far from each other. And because you see that quite well in the signal, that the R peak, for example, is much higher when you have a higher distance. For the positioning, it's also a topic because like you can have, for example, the same distance. Let's say we take this belt and you have here the classical distance. And on the heart area, the signal quality would be very excellent. But if you hold it, for example, like that, you will realize that the R peak would not be as high. Maybe some other waves will be higher. So it's not only the distance, it's really also the positioning.
And basically from my physiology studies, the axis of the heart goes like 45 degrees about.
Yes, that's also good.
How does it affect? So the heart rate belt has been decided that they are kind of horizontal, and sometimes you see that it's the 45 degrees, and now you said that the vertical is not good. What does it actually, what makes the difference, and what would be recommended for different situations?
It depends what you want to measure. Like the vertical, apparently by cardiologists, also a very valid positioning. There was one cardiologist who did a lot of study on that, and that's why the patches are mainly here. But normally what cardiologists told me, and you have to keep in mind, I'm the business guy, so I'm not the scientist behind it, but as long you have the heart and then you basically go through the heart in different directions, you are good from the signal quality. So the 45 axis, the maybe 90-degree axis, and that's already a good base.
Yeah. No, very interesting. I haven't thought these. And then if we go a little bit for the applications, so people might want to measure for cardiology purposes, maybe the full ECG curve. Very common is stress research. You look at the HRV and analyze the autonomic nervous system function. Some people measure during sleep, which is different posture, different pressure from the bed. How would you choose the electrode type based on the application?
On the one hand, I will look at the activity. So if the patient, let's say, is lying the whole time because of some pathologies, so then you can kind of choose there all kind of electrodes, because if there is not much movement, the signal quality still would be okay, even with dry electrodes. But if there is activity involved, then you better go for electrodes which is known for long-term measurement, because it just guarantees that the circumstance for the measuring, it's better than other electrodes which are only for short term. And then obviously if you have short-term electrodes, but for example with movement, and there are some short-term electrodes which hold well during a short movement, but then it also depends how much the patient is sweating. So in the hospitals, often they go for long-term electrodes when they do the stress test with the bike or the running, because of the holding, because of the offset net button and so on. So mostly they don't go so much into that, which electrodes to use. They just go for the long term because they are safe.
And how is it with the wet gel electrode? When you're sleeping, you actually might have a pressure on it. Does the gel come out of this side wall, or how would you say use a wet gel?
It depends. It depends on which electrode. So for example, with the Ambu, the wall is quite strong and quite hard, which is another topic for patient comfort. But in terms of keeping the gel together, it does a good job. But then there are some other electrodes which have, for example, a lot of gel, and then there you see that it comes out.
So a lot of things to consider to get the best possible signal quality. And then if a researcher or a clinician is doing multi-day ECG measurement, what would be the kind of the advice, how to get as good signal, what mistakes to avoid, and so on?
So the advice to get good signal is use a good electrode. Don't use the cheapest of the cheapest, because their use case is for short term. And then it depends. I mean, so let's say if you use our electrodes, and now I'm making advertisement for our electrodes, obviously, the patient doesn't need any additional instruction. You can shower with them, you can let them on. After 7 days or 10 days, you take them off and you have the same signal quality like a Ambu Blue sensor. But when you have Ambu, then you have to instruct the patient well, that after 3 days, he takes it off. Or after showering, he takes it off and change them. So the instruction factor can be very important. Also, that they place it right, that they know how to attach the cables or how to attach the sensor. And the older the patient, the more difficult it can be for them. So and some other points, I think that is the most important. Don't use very cheap electrodes. Use more the famous one for long term.
Yeah. Sounds good. So this has been interesting discussion how to choose the electrodes for long-term HRV and ECG monitoring. So let's wrap up this episode here, and with José, we will then in the next episode talk about how new electrode technology can improve data in long-term measurements. Thank you.
Thank you too, Ollie. Thanks.